Hi, my name's Manny Vacchiano, and I'm here to talk to you today about some of the key risks that drive the stock price of biopharma companies. This is an AMP investor educational quickie, so I'm hoping to stay under 10 minutes if I don't ramble on too much. What I'm going to talk about today relates to small and mid-cap biopharma companies that we'll broadly define as companies with market caps between $100 million and $5 billion. These companies are usually losing money. Many times they're losing tens of millions of dollars a quarter. Their key assets are typically clinical stage pre-commercial assets. That is, they're drugs that are in clinical trials. And these trials are expensive. That's why they're losing a lot of money in their early stages. Now, the effect of the risks that I'm going to talk about is that when the risk is either reduced or increased, the stock price is affected. So, for example, if the risk is reduced substantially, the stock price increases substantially. And that's, of course, for most of us, our hope in investing in these companies. Now, the first risk that I'm going to mention and talk about is the regulatory approval risk. This has two aspects: clinical trial results and the risk of those results, and the regulatory agency review process risk. So let's first talk about the biggie, the biggest risk, the biggest factor, which are clinical trial results for these companies. These results are safety results and efficacy results. They're readouts of clinical trials. Typically, for big trials, important trials, companies that will announce what quarter that the results will come out, and then one day that quarter, they will, usually it's outside of the normal market hours, they will announce their results, the safety and efficacy results. And this is the biggest risk factor because it affects the regulatory agency review process. It affects the future commercial success of these companies. Now, before there's a robust human clinical trial for the vast majority of these drugs, their first human clinical trial that's a robust efficacy trial will fail. Like most of the time, these fail. Don't forget that. There's a lot of risk in these companies. But of course, sometimes they pass. So if there's a robust clinical readout, first major efficacy readout, and it's positive, good safety, good efficacy, woohoo! We're talking about major reduction of the risk of regulatory approval, major reduction in the risk of commercial success. In other words, now that there's a good robust trial, good positive results, safety and efficacy, the drug is much more likely to be approved by the FDA, for example, in the US, much more likely to be commercially successful. What does that mean? The risk associated with this company has gone down substantially, and that's why the share price often skyrockets in these situations. Now, the second part of the regulatory approval risk is the regulatory agency review risk. So even if there's very clean, positive clinical trial results, really good, robust phase 3 results, there still is always regulatory approval risk. Why? Well, we call this the CMC risk. This is the chemistry, manufacturing, and control risk. This is a tricky risk for investors in public companies because in many situations, really almost always, we don't have insider information. We don't really know if there are manufacturing issues. For example, is there a robust manufacturing process? Is the FDA happy with the manufacturing controls, the standard operating procedures that are in place? It's a really tricky one for us as investors. We've looked at this quite a bit at AMP, and at some point we might publish some of the results we've seen that gives us kind of a better sense of what the actual percent risk is. But for this educational session, Suffice to say that there is always CMC risk upon a regulatory approval review. So that's the first major risk factor, the regulatory approval risk. The second risk factor I want to talk about is commercial success. So even if a drug is approved, beautiful clinical results, got through the FDA and approved, and the drug is approved, it still may not be commercially successful. Why might that be, you ask yourself? Well, maybe it's not better than competitive products. Maybe it's too expensive for the benefit that it brings. Or maybe there's an ineffective commercial team. For these small and mid-cap biopharma companies, many times this is their first approved drug. They've got a new commercial team, new sales force that are competing many times against big pharma, established and entrenched sales teams. So this is a big risk factor for these companies, and they often struggle if they need to commercialize on their own their first drug. So there is this commercial success risk that is always there. That's the second risk. The third risk is the near-term dilution event risk. As I mentioned near the beginning of this, these companies are losing money. Clinical trials are very expensive. They're burning through a lot of cash. They need to raise money to do more clinical trials, to submit all the dense paperwork that they need to submit to the FDA. And to raise money, they typically do follow-on offerings. So they do their initial public offering, hopefully raise a lot of money, burn through that money as they're doing their clinical trials. They need to raise more money. The raises often follow positive clinical trial results. Because the valuation of the company has gone way up, it's a great time to raise more money. So if there's a positive result, maybe the stock price goes up 100% overnight, phenomenal. Often within a day or a few days, you'll see a follow-on offering. That'll pull the stock price down in many situations. Some, and that's because the company's taken advantage of that high share price and their increased valuation to raise more money to let them continue on. Otherwise, they would go bankrupt. The other way that these companies can raise money is through loans. Those typically happen later in the cycle when a company is very close to approval or when it's early commercial. Now, how do these risk factors affect the stock price? More specifically, more quantitatively. So when we value these companies, you can use any of a number of models. You can use a comparative valuation model. You can use some kind of revenue multiple. You can use a free cash flow model. Whatever model you're using, the initial valuation, the initial number you're coming up with, maybe you say, hey, this is $1 billion valuation. Well, you need to multiply that number by the regulatory approval risk and the commercial success risk. So if you've got $1 billion valuation base, let's say, you may have only a 10% chance of regulatory approval success in the early phases of a company, in the early stages of a drug, and maybe only a 10% commercial chance of success. So then you're multiplying $1 billion times 0.1 times 0.1. So that's kind of how these risk factors play into the valuation and the stock price of these companies. So a clinical trial result, let's say it's the first robust human clinical trial for a drug, it can have a huge effect because maybe now the risk goes from a 90% risk, a 0.1, to maybe a 40% risk or a 0.6. So there can be a huge effect. I mean, that's a little extreme, but maybe we go from a 10% chance of success to a 25% chance of regulatory success on one clinical trial readout. And that's why it can have such an impact on the share price overnight after these readouts happen. And then, as I mentioned, the positive move can often be offset by a dilution event, which will bring the stock price down some. So in summary, there's three major risks. The regulatory approval risk, which has two aspects: the big daddy, which is clinical trial results and the risks that come with those results, and the fact that the vast majority of these trials for a new drug and a new indication, a new target, most of them will fail, but of course some succeed. That's the big daddy, the clinical trial results risk. And then there's the risk related to the regulatory agency review. Even if there's great clinical trial results, there is always that CMC risk. Next, we've got the commercial success risk. Even if you get through and you've got a drug approved, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful in the marketplace, and it costs a lot to market these drugs. And then finally, we've got this ever-standing risk of near-term dilution. These companies are burning a lot of cash getting through clinical trials, putting together truckloads of paperwork for the FDA, then having these huge commercial teams. This costs a lot of money. So we always have this near-term dilution event. So those are the three major risks. I hope you learned some valuable information from this educational quickie, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.